next speaker is yet one of those other Bay Area Skeptics presidents. Jay Diamond is the chairman of Bay Area Skeptics, the oldest regional skeptical group in North America. He holds dual master's degrees in engineering and business and has managed both startup companies and $100 million programs. Jay has lectured around the world on science and technology, business, and critical thinking, and was the first speaker on the last day of the last of James Randi's amazing meetings. Yep. He's going to talk about Hemlock to hashtags, evolving persuasion.
So, yeah, because I was the first speaker on the last day, the last amazing meeting, some people say that I killed the amazing meeting.
Yeah, you did, you did. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. So, today I'm going to be talking about what I think most Americans want to hear on Super Bowl Sunday in the next 20 minutes.
What? This is Super Bowl Sunday?
It's Super Bowl Sunday. So naturally I'm going to be talking about ancient Greek philosophy and mathematics. So I know I have a captive audience. This will be riveting, I promise you. So the title of my talk is Hemlock to Hashtags, and I'll explain why in a moment. Some fundamentals of skepticism. Is everyone fooled and misled in knowledge? And recognizing our biases and identifying areas requiring more research and where we have to say this is unknown or unknowable. And the last piece of this is sharing that knowledge. So that is educating, refuting, in some cases debunking. It's how do we take the knowledge that we've learned and share that beyond ourselves and beyond the choir, which is another thing we've talked about today. So you've heard many talks today on all of these different things, but my talk today is primarily on that last one, which is persuasion. And so while it's on persuasion, it's also on how we guide others to acquire knowledge, how we share knowledge, and how we convince people of the validity of that knowledge. For me, this all starts about 2,500 years ago with something that very often we talk about as skeptics, but I've come to understand most skeptics don't really understand very well. And that is the Socratic method. So I was at a conference recently where somebody was telling me, they were talking all about the new Socratic method, and they're going off, and I say, so do you know where this comes from? They say, well, Socrates. And that's absolutely true, but it occurred to me that skeptics don't really know where a lot of this stuff comes from. And I think it's worth just taking a minute to look at where this comes from and why it's important to skeptics. So Socrates was a Greek philosopher who lived from 470 to 399 BCE, credited as one of the founders of Western philosophy. He was sentenced to death in 399 BC by drinking hemlock, hence the name of my talk, for corrupting the youth of Athens with unorthodox ideas. Sounds like a guy we all want to hang out with, right? The other interesting thing about Socrates is he never really wrote anything. His student was Plato. Plato wrote these dialogues in which Socrates would have conversations with various people about big ideas. What is virtue? What is justice? What is knowledge? Big, big, big ideas, many of which don't have clear answers. And he would try and sort those things out through these dialogues. And so we don't really know whether these dialogues are pieces of fiction or whether they're historical accounts. And honestly, it doesn't really matter. But that's what we call the Socratic problem. The important thing is what we actually learn from this stuff. So this whole idea of telling stories, of having narratives that are persuasive and memorable, are something that are a great way to imbue knowledge on other people. And that's one of the reasons why these stories have survived 2,400 years. And they're one of the most complete surviving documents of that time. So throughout these dialogues, Socrates demonstrates collaborative inquisition to uncover truth. The Greeks believed that knowledge was innate, that these concepts, justice, knowledge, truth, they existed outside of human beings, and we could rediscover them if we went through the correct process to actually understand those things. Now remember, this was 25 years ago, and we know a lot more about knowledge now. We have many, many other ideas, and honestly, none of that really matters. The important thing is what you can take away from this and what's important to society today. So, one of the examples that I wanted to pull out of this was one of Plato's dialogues. The dialogue is called Meno, where he discusses with one of his contemporaries, a philosopher named Meno, and there's a specific part of this dialogue in which he teaches a young slave how to do some pretty sophisticated math that I'm going to walk you through in a second, all right? Can I see a show of hands? How many of you are familiar with this dialogue and this story? 1, 2, and that's it. Okay, great, excellent. All right. So, if you all raised your hands.
Is this first person? Is this written down so it's not, it's accurate, it's first person, it's not word of mouth?
So this is written down 2,400 years ago. We don't know whether this is a historical account or whether this is fictitious. And it doesn't matter to the point.
But it hasn't changed over 2,500 years.
Well, I'm sure it's changed. I'm sure it's changed, as any story will change over 2,400 years. But it's being written down and transcribed, and of course, I'm sure it was written in Greek. So, all right. In this story, he educates this slave. This slave who had no education. He probably knew how to count, and that was all. How to do some math. He tells the slave very little. He asks questions repeatedly of the slave, and I'll walk you through this process. And of course, in doing so, Plato at the time believed he could reawaken this inherent knowledge that existed in the universe that this slave would then rediscover. So he starts off by taking a stick and drawing in the sand this square, and the square is 1 unit by 1 unit. You can make up whatever unit you want there, it doesn't matter to this. The square has an area of 1. It is size 1, okay? If we double the side, the length of the side of that square, so it is 2 units long. The square then has an area, a size of 4. And we know that because we can count the squares, 1, 2, 3, 4. So Plato walks the slave through this process, and he draws, the 4 squares. That's clear. And then he asks a question. And the question he asks is, how long does each side need to be for a square that is twice as large? That is, that has an area of 8. Now, just for a second, start to solve this in your heads, okay? You all have far more knowledge, far more education than this slave would have ever had. Literally, he probably never would have gone to school, probably knew how to count on his fingers, and that was all, okay? All right, so the slave says, well, I kind of have a pretty good idea how this is working now. You took 1 to 2, so I'm going to go 2 to 4. So he doubles it to 4. Well, Socrates draws a 4 by 4 in the sand, and it's very clear if you count these squares, it adds up to 16. So it is twice as big as our goal. It's literally twice as big. So that's clearly incorrect. And so the slave understands that he's overshot. And he says, so what do we do now? The slave says, well, let me do another guess. So he says, well, okay, if 2 is too small, 4 is too big, it must be 3. And so Socrates draws out a 3 by 3 square, and of course, the size is still too big. It's not nearly as big. It's only 9 now, and of course, we're shooting for 8 as an area. But it's better, but it's still too big. So this is a key moment in the way that we all learn. And we're taking a second just to discuss how we learn. Because the slave is now in what we call a state of aporia. Is anyone here familiar with that word? Okay, so this is a word that I wasn't very familiar with until I started refreshing myself on this case. And this is now one of my favorite words, and you'll learn why in a second, all right? So, Socrates' questions have exposed a contradiction in the mind of the slave. The slave was pretty sure if it wasn't 2 and it wasn't 4, it had to be 3. It's pretty sure. And then it's just being demonstrated that it can't be 3. It's not 3. Something's wrong there. And so there is distress. There's confusion. The contradiction cannot stand if the slave is going to move forward. He can't hold both of those things in his mind at once. So aporia is an irresolvable internal contradiction. So it comes from the group aporos, which means without passage. You cannot pass by this, okay? This stage is often key to us learning and gaining new knowledge. We've realized something in our mental framework has to change. Now, I want to juxtapose this with something that skeptics often talk about, which is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you hold 2 conflicting thoughts in your head at the same time. So an example of this is, I believe in the value of health, but I'm a smoker. And so you justify one, you kind of hold them both, and you say, well, you know, I'm mostly healthy, and smoking isn't that bad for you, so somehow you kind of hold those in. Aporia is a little bit different. Okay? Aporia is that point where you say, I can't hold both of these at the same time. So the slave at this stage really doesn't know how to continue. So Socrates starts to guide him. And he says, okay, if I were to draw a diagonal on just one of these squares, and you look at the size of just that shaded half, how big is that? He says, well, that would be about half the size of that square. So he says, okay, and what happens if I look at a larger piece of the square? And he says, well, I can kind of count this up, so it's 1 full one and 2 half ones, so that would be 2. And so the area of that lower square is 4, and the shaded part is 2, so it's half. And he says, so what can you make of that? And he starts to extend this out to all the other squares, and quickly realizes that he has a square within the larger square, the shaded part there, that is an area of 8. Okay? So, the red line shown here is the answer to the problem. Now, they wouldn't have actually calculated this, but that doesn't matter to the problem. The important thing here is that they've solved a problem, and they could literally take a measurement and use that for to solve various things that they needed to do. This is a useful piece of knowledge. The slave has actually solved something pretty complex here. So with guidance, the slave has solved a problem that seemed intractable. It seemed impossible for the slave to do at the beginning of this. Let's take a little step back, all right? We're going to look at now a mathematical treatment of this. And this is something that most of you are going to remember if you remember your high school math. So, what is the side length of that new square? Well, that is the hypotenuse of the triangle you see in blue there. It is the red side. And so, how do you solve for hypotenuse of an isosceles triangle? Well, that is something called the Pythagorean theorem. And the Pythagorean theorem was something that was probably developed about 1,000 years before this dialogue was written. It probably wasn't developed by Pythagoras, but Pythagoras formalized it and popularized it, okay? So this would have been known at the time, but of course, the question is, how do we then solve for this? So solving for this, it's 2 squared plus 2 squared equals the hypotenuse squared. And that number ends up being the square root of 8, or 2.82843, and it goes on. It is what we like to call an irrational number. And as we all know, skeptics hate irrationality. And by the way, the Greeks hated irrational numbers. They thought everything should be simple and whole, and this extended beyond mathematics. But the idea is, this would not have been a number they would have calculated, but it would have been still a useful piece of information. And we now want to take a look at why all of this is remarkable. Well, the first piece is the slave had untapped cognitive potential. He solved the Pythagorean theorem. Probably didn't call it that, probably didn't calculate it to 27 digits, doesn't matter. He basically solved the Pythagorean theorem. Think of all the things that you could do that you don't think you can do today, your untapped potential. Think of the potential of all those people around you that you often think are dumbasses, that are doing really stupid things in society. Those people have amazing cognitive potential that is untapped. So Socrates guided the slave to get to an answer pretty much on his own. That slave now has much more confidence to go off and try new things, to apply this new knowledge, to really kind of venture out in the world and do new things he'd never done before. No, Socrates did not give him the answer. He didn't say, well, the answer is square root of 8. Could have done that, right? Didn't call him stupid for not knowing it. The slave pretty much came to the answer on his own. The slave has grown, and society is slightly better as a result. The other thing is there are many approaches to problem solving. Not everyone solves things exactly the same way, and that's fine. You probably would have solved this problem a little differently. And different people solve problems in different ways, and not only is that okay, but that's kind of remarkable. Now, let's fast forward for a second and see how this problem would probably play out in 2025. Well, obviously, Socrates would have posted on Twitter, would have posted the question on there, something like that. And the slave would have responded something like, I think that the answer is 4. And then someone obviously would have responded something like, nah, bro, you dumb. ChatGPT says 2.8 because somebody went out to ChatGPT and just checked the answer, or Google, or they used something for it. They may not have even understood how to solve it, but they knew to go somewhere to figure out how to solve it. And then, of course, it would have degraded rapidly from there.
Yeah.
The point is, that Socratic method is mostly lost in this case. So let's look at a little bit of the Socratic method in the 21st century. So today, even though we don't always call it this, the Socratic method is used across many disciplines, okay? It's used in medical training, in education, psychotherapy, corporate leadership training, conflict resolution, mediation, all kinds of disciplines. And there are a bunch of modern techniques that try to formalize this or use it in slightly different ways, but it's still that same Socratic method. It's still that idea of socially getting to an answer by asking lots of questions. And so the first one of these is the modern Socratic method, and that's really just a formalized way that people have done of actually making the questions just a lot clearer, so that there's a very straightforward framework people can follow. Are any of you familiar with street epistemology? So yeah, so I see a number of hands. So street epistemology is a very simple kind of targeted application of the Socratic method, in which it tries to be a little more interventionist versus the kind of neutral inquiry that we often do with skeptics, or that Socrates would have done, while still trying to avoid conflict. So it avoids debate, refutation on facts, versus understanding what's behind a claim. So asking questions like, how did you confirm that information? That kind of stuff. There's a focus on decision-making, the decision-making process versus the entrenched positions that the people may have going into it. And very often, street epistemology is mostly associated with discussing religion, with people that are very entrenched on their position. It doesn't have to be, it can be used for all kinds of things. The last one that I want to talk about was AI and chatbots. We're using all kinds of amazing technology today to use the Socratic method to draw people along a conversation and persuade them of truths in society. And so actually next month for Bay Area Skeptics, we have a speaker talking about something called DebunkBot, which is an AI chatbot that actually uses the Socratic method to try to convince people that the conspiracy theory that they are very deeply invested in may not be accurate. Second Thursday of the month, I'm hearing from Jeannie Scott. So again, there's all kinds of interesting applications to this going on today. So what are the lessons for skeptics out of this? Well, the first is stories. Very powerful learning tools. You know, if you look at something like Malcolm Gladwell, sold millions of books, right? There's a lot of data in his books, but really he tells stories. He gives anecdotes, because anecdotes are super powerful. And one of the reasons that that Plato's dialogues have lasted this long is they are great stories that people can remember and people can relate to and people can recite. There are huge benefits of collaborative inquiry. So rather than simply giving people the facts and wondering why they don't absorb them, we can have a conversation. It's a better way to facilitate than to dictate arguments from authority. I know this, here's the answer, that's all you need to know. Owning someone, because you have more knowledge than them, feels good for a moment, but loses the opportunity to make the world a better place. And understanding is better than victory. So there's a huge value in aporia. You have the opportunity, if you can reach aporia with someone, to change their mind forever. You get them out of cognitive dissonance, and many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the backfire effect, where you give people data that refutes a strongly held belief of theirs, and their tendency is to dig in deeper. Now, we can argue about how strong that effect is, and there's been a lot of questions about that, but it's a real effect, okay? The last thing I want to point out is there is amazing cognitive potential in all of us that is untapped. And digging into that, being able to tap that potential has a huge opportunity to make the world better. The motto that I like to live by is that if we can all just make one person think a little more critically, society benefits. And that's my talk. Thank you. Can I see a show of hands? Is that the best talk you've all heard today on ancient Greek philosophy and mathematics?
Absolutely.
Mission accomplished. Notice how I asked that question. I didn't tell you it was.
I'm actually looking for Gwen. Gwen, are you here? We have some time for questions. He's faster than I am, so just think.
So I would argue that the slave didn't solve the problem. The process that both Socrates and the slave engaged in solved the problem. And if the slave could internalize that process, then he would go on to do a lot better. But Socrates led the slave in the process, the question asking and checking and doing all that.
That's absolutely true. Think about how you can lead people into discussions about things that on which they have deeply held beliefs.
We're not in disagreement.
We're not in disagreement, but again, the whole point here is the process is more important than the answer. The process is the answer for skeptics.
Does this work for people who have different political beliefs?
This works for everything. So think about this. So we use the example of street epistemology. You can go online and you can see there are whole podcasts on street epistemology where people talk to people with very strong religious beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you may think today that we're very politically siloed, but people with religious beliefs, they've had those beliefs since they were very, very small. They've lived their entire lives with those beliefs. And if those people can be dislodged from those beliefs using this technique, then it can be used for anything.
Mm-hmm. Do we have examples of how we convince, say, a religious person that his religion is not right? Do you have any example?
So I'm not going to go through those here. For one good reason is that this is not a religious discussion, right? We're skeptics. We're non-religious. We believe in evidence. We believe in science. You can go onto it's probably streetepistemology.com, and there are whole podcasts where you can literally hear people having these discussions, and they will take you through that process because it is like pretty well formalized. It's, by the way, it's pretty fascinating to listen to some of
Yeah.
this.
Mm-hmm. So what does the collaborative inquiry mean? Can you give an example?
Yeah, so that's this idea of rather than me lecturing to you, this is how this works. Follow this process and it will work. It's that idea of Socrates asking the slave, so what do you think this means? What do we do next? What's the answer to this? And actually having that moment of, is this correct? Let's examine this together. Because actually having that collaboration, and in many, so I use the Mino dialogue as an example, and I think I love that example because it's so kind of nicely packaged. But many of Plato's dialogues are about what is justice. Well, in that dialogue, he goes back and forth with various people saying, well, it's more like this or it's more like that, and they kind of get to an understanding together, because the truth is they don't always know the answer. My favorite thing when I use the Socratic method is when somebody teaches me something I didn't already know. That's, when I get to that moment of aporia, I'm changed forever. Make sense?
What if people think they already know?
Have you met Americans? People think they know a lot of stuff. And I can joke about Americans, but it's humans, right? I mean, one of the reasons...
He's Canadian. That's the context.
To be fair, I'm a dual citizen, so I'm hated by two countries. But, so, I'm not quite sure what you're looking for on this.
Is there another question? On my way.
So as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking about my Moonlight dialogues. And in that, there were as the sort of a principal person who I'm interacting with, where we regularly talk directly, and there's a trust and there's a relationship built
Yep.
in. That person will then go to talk to kind of other people on the outside who are getting the same information but don't have a relationship with me, and I see that those kind of the comments coming from those people are very, very angry, very, very negative, sort of framing me as an enemy. as opposed to a
Right.
co-explorer.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of developing relationship and connection and trust, and your thoughts about how to build that to allow these conversations to take place.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, asking sincere questions where you don't go in with a superior standpoint. You don't go in as an expert on something. You don't go in as an authority. You go in to explore with them, being sincere, being open to the fact that you might learn something new. I mean, so there's a group we have called Leonard, what's the name? Do we have Leonard Trammell here?
Yes.
Leonard, what's the name of the group we have that's out of CFI that looks at
CFIIG.
CFIIG, thank you, the CFI investigation group. So we go off and we talk to people about claims of the paranormal. People will come in and we have a $500,000 prize where people can claim, I can levitate something, or I can set something on fire with my head, or I can use telepathy. And when we go in with these people, my goal, talking to these people who believe very different things than we do, is for me to win a Nobel Prize because they're going to teach me something new. Because if they're right, it changes everything. And I'm honestly excited about that. And they get that. They understand that. If I go in saying, you're going to fail, the conversation ends very quickly. Also, you know, we go through a process with this group where we develop a protocol that is a scientific protocol that they agree to. Now, they usually don't understand science, the scientific method, or statistics. And so we have to explain to them why it's important that we do these things. And when you explain it in a way that is very straightforward, they understand it and they come along on the journey with you. The whole idea is coming along on the journey together. And then I see you're journaling me. I'm very excited about that. I'm being journaled right now.
We can have a couple more.
Does that answer your question?
It does. That's really helpful.
I think related to the idea of journaling and writing it down, another example might be a way of, well, if you didn't understand that, let me try to find another way to explain it to you. If you don't understand that, I'll try to find another way, another example or metaphor to help you understand the concept.
Absolutely, and the only thing I want to bring up there is it's not about explaining to them why they're wrong, right? It's about this idea that people learn in different ways. There are different ways to get to an answer, and very often there are different answers that it's the same answer, but it doesn't necessarily look the same, right? You know, square root of 8 doesn't look like the red line in the diagram. Right? Some people are going to understand that red line. Let me ask you a question here. Show of hands. How many people would have solved that problem using the way that Socrates showed the slave? Anybody? Nobody. Right? Right? It's Greek.
It's Greek to me.
It's Greek to her. So, like, that's honestly kind of fascinating to me, right? Because I think most of us think that when we understand something, everyone else is going to understand it the same way. That's just not the human condition, right? And so being open to having people learn things in very different ways and going along on that collaborative journey, I think is a real key to skepticism that we need to embrace if we want to change the world.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.